Welcome to this week's Parsha, Parshat Shlach. This week we are going to talk about the people who go into Israel. And we're going to talk about them like that and not as the spies, because as we'll see, it's not clear that that was the intention of the mission that was given to those men who were going into Israel. And I think that it has become such a ubiquitous name for that mission and for those people that sometimes it's hard for us to separate out the pshat from the midrash. So here we're going to make a explicit effort to not call them spies and to call them scouts. I'm sure that I will make a mistake, but that's what we're going to try to do. So in this week's Parsha, right, last week's Parsha, just to remind everyone, was like sort of that tipping point between everything is great, we're about to be in Israel, to everything is terrible, and God wants to burn the whole camp to the ground. So last week, the people complained for no reason. Then they complained that they didn't like the man. And this week we wake up to, or we come into a new challenge. And I will share my screen here. Let's see, there we go. And so we see in the very opening words of our Parsha. Oh, hello, Sherry. It looks like you're here now. How wonderful. Hello. So the very first opening words of our parsha, Shlach lecha anashim v'yaturu et haaretz Canaan asher ani noten livnei Yisrael. Right. So the parsha opens with God talking to Moshe, and God says, "Send men, anashim, to scout the land of Canaan." Right, to scout, not to spy. The land of Canaan, which I have given to Bnei Yisrael. Ish echad lemate avotav tishlachu kol nasi bahem. And you should send one person from each of the Shvatim to go to the land of Israel. And so Rashi immediately puts the word spy into our vocabulary, right? Because he says, Lama nismecha parshat miraglim leparshat Miriam. So he's asking a different question, but he uses the terminology of spies in such a decisive way, right? He calls this parshat miraglim, the chapter or the section of the spies. And he asks why it's connected to the chapter on Miriam's punishment. So at the very end of last week's parsha, Miriam gets tzara'at, for speaking about Moshe's wife, or Moshe and his wife, right? And so here Rashi says, Lafi shelakta al iskei diba, shedibra ba'achliya, urishaim halalu ra'u velo lakhu musar. Right, so he's quoting the Midrash Tanchuma, so this idea of calling them spies is very old. And Rashi says that the connection between the parsha of Miriam talking Lashon Hara about Moshe and the spies going into Israel is that they too spoke Lashon Hara. And what's worse, the reason they're next to each other is because we see that the scouts could have learned from Miriam. And they could have not, or Miriam's punishment more accurately, and they could have not spoken badly about the land of Israel, and yet they did. So let's look and see a little bit what this means, that they were speaking badly, right? So this is 30 psukim later. So shlach lecha is at the very beginning. Then Moshe does in fact shlach, right? He sends them out. They come back. V'yotziu dibat haaretz asher taru, right? Again, the word here is latur, vayaturu and taru. They scouted out the land, right? And they come back and they speak about it to Bnei Israel, saying, right? The land which we went to scout, that this is a land that will devour its settlers. So they produced bad reports. So what does that mean? V'yotziu dibat haaretz. The Ibn Ezra says, Davar shelo haya ve'en chen v'yavo Yosef ki v'yavo hafech v'yotziu. So he says they said a thing which never happened, right? That's super interesting when we think about scouting or touring, right? Anyone who's ever looked at a tour guide before, right? There's such a thing as a bad review. oh, that restaurant was terrible, or the line for this attraction is so long you'll never get to see it before you give up and go get ice cream. Those might be bad reports. And the Ibn Ezra is sort of teasing that apart and saying, actually, what they're saying here is something that never happened. It's something that we that is a lie, right? Just as Miriam maybe said a lie of some sort. And so instead it's like saying the line is so long you'll never get in, when in fact there is no line. There's never a line to that attraction. And interestingly, the Ibn Ezra steers us to a different case. And it's the case of Yosef. And so here, we're going to take a little trip back through time to look at some actual spies, perhaps, and to see what they have in common, or maybe don't have in common, with our week's Parsha, right? So here we have our scouts. They are continuously asked Latour to scout the land. And it seems that the thing that they do wrong is that they bring back bad reports. And what do these bad reports remind us of? Oh, the Ibn Ezra says they remind us of Yosef. Okay, so what happens with Yosef, right? If we go all the way back in time to the fall, Ela toldot Yaakov, right? We learn that this is the line of Yaakov. Yosef ben Shva Asrei Shana haya ro'eh et achav batzon, v'hu na'ar et bnei Bilhav et bnei Zilpah nishei aviv. Yosef is 17 years of age, and he is also a shepherd with his brothers. He helps the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. A whole class could be taught unto itself there. V'yaveh Yosef et zibatam ra'a el avihem, and Yosef brought bad reports to them, to their father. And so it seems like there's some connection that the Ibn Ezra feels towards this other time where there was a diba ra'ah. And maybe it's to say that look at the terrible things that happen when you speak dvarim dibot, right, ra'ot or ra'im, right, is what happens is really you set in motion a bad chain of events that you quickly lose control of, right? Yosef tells these bad reports to his father, perhaps if we understand them the way that Ibn Ezra does, untrue reports. This causes his brothers to hate him, to be sold down to Mitzrayim, to be estranged from his family, right? And so similarly, maybe the Ibn Ezra is saying the scouts didn't really understand how quickly it would spiral. That once they brought bad reports, that people wouldn't want to go into the land, and the sort of the wandering in the desert would continue indefinitely. So that's one option. But the other option might be that he's calling us to Yosef because there's actually one of the very few times in the Torah where the word meraglim, right, which is what Rashi calls this parsha, the parshat meraglim, is used, is talking about the Yosef story. So it's not at the same spot as the dibatam ra'ah of Yosef, but it's once Yosef had all the terrible dominoes have fallen and Yosef is in the lands of Egypt, that he is in control, right? He's the vizier of Egypt, and his brothers come to him. And they don't know, right, that he is Yosef yet. And what does Yosef call the brothers? V'yizkor Yosef et hachalamot. He remembers his dreams, asher chalam lahem, that he dreamed about them, right, about being the one that everyone bows down to. V'yomer alehem meraglim atem, right? This is the place where someone is called an actual spy. You are spies. Lirot et ervat haaretz batem. You have come to see the land in its nakedness. And so there's something here about spying, and what does a spy do? The spy sees the land sort of as it is, as it's uncovered in its worst way, maybe is the way to think about it. And the brothers protest, right? I sort of picked and chose the psukim I wanted here. And they say, Lo hayu avadecha meraglim. We your servants, we have never been spies. And then Yosef repeats, Asher dibartem alechem lemor meraglim atem shilchu michem echad v'yikach et achichem v'atem he'asaru v'yivchanu divrechem ha'emet itchem. Right? He says, it is as I have told you, you are spies. And this is where the test comes up, right? To see if there is truth in their words. Because again, spies are people who don't tell the truth, right? Otherwise, by the life of Paro, ki meraglim atem. And so the chapter of the spies, the real Parshat HaMeraglim, seems to be here with Yosef. It seems to be a place where there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of injustice that seems to be carried out here. And Yosef is the one to uncover that injustice. And in fact, when Moshe goes back to tell the people, to remind the people of what had happened here, right? In Sefer Devarim, it's all Moshe sort of recounting of the stories that had come up already. It's here that he says, "V'ifnu ve'alu hahara ve'avru ad nachal eshkol va'yiraglu ota." Right? This is another place where the word spies come out. And so here, perhaps we see two things. One is this interesting connection to the very beginning of our story, right? To right before we leave the land of Israel and go down to Canaan, go down to Egypt, that is somehow going to link us back to our story and our actions right now. And the other is to realize that if we see ourselves as spies, then we will be spies, right? And in fact, even if God asks us latur, we decided to miragel instead, right? And that's what Moshe reminds us of here. So I think that there's something here about thinking about what it means to spy and what it means to scout. And in fact, there is this really fascinating piece in Kiddushin, which I think is relevant here, which is sort of about this ervat haaretz, right? That what does Yosef say spies do? They come to see the land in its nakedness, sort of like catch it with its pants down, right? In an inappropriate way. And what does the Kiddushin say? Or maybe let's pause for one moment. Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas? This is like a big thought into itself, and we'll look at that extra text in a second. But any like connections that you see between Yosef and Moshe, or the Meraglim, and the 12 representatives to go scout the lands of Israel? Okay, everyone can gather their thoughts throughout, and we can come back to it. So the okay. So this source in Kiddushin is Rav Yehuda saying in the name of Rav Yehuda Amer Rav, Asur la'adam shekadesh et ha'isha ad shiur ena, right? That a man must see his wife to be before he agrees to betroth himself to her, or her to him, lest he see something ad shiur ena shema yir'eh ba davar miguneh, that there might be something repugnant to him, which is sort of a weird, maybe a weird rule in Kiddushin, right? That you might find the person to be repugnant to you. But it seems like what you're saying is you have, what the Kiddushin is saying is you have to lay eyes on something before you claim it, right? And so perhaps, right, God is not asking the people to spy, right, to go and see the land in its nakedness, or to tell lies or tell sort of untruths about the land of Israel. But maybe instead what God was asking is to lay eyes on the thing they're about to claim, to go look at it, to say, look, the land of Israel, it's beautiful, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, or it's really challenging, it's going to be hard to capture it, whatever that thing is, but not to spy on it. Right. So it's sort of like a subtle thing, right? That may be just like, Bnei Israel can't lay claim to the land of Israel until they see it. Rav Yehuda is making this analogy that one shouldn't lay claim to their wife until they see him or her, right? To sort of reinforce that it's a good thing. Until now, it's a land that is as sort of hazy as the story of Yosef and the spies are to the people in Israel, and that it's really just something that they haven't seen yet. And so I want to finish my thoughts and then welcome yours by reading a little bit from Rabbi Sachs's article called "What is Going On?" Because here I think he beautifully describes the difference between these two things, right? The spying, the miragel, and and the latour, the sort of the seeing, the scouting of the place. So he says biblical Hebrew has two verbs that mean to spy or to look, right? One is lachpor and one is leragel. And neither of those words, right, as we noted, appear in our parsha. That is the point. Instead, no less than 12 times we encounter the rare verb latour. It's been revived in modern Hebrew, right? And means and sounds like to tour. Tayar is to be a tourist, but there is all the difference in the world between a tourist and a spy. The Malbim explains the difference simply. Latour means to seek out the good, right? That's the man who is going to seek out his wife, right? That is what tourists do. They go to the beautiful, the majestic, the inspiring. They don't spend their time trying to find out what is bad, right? No one goes to Paris and says, like, go looking for the bad stuff. They say, go see the Eiffel Tower, have, French baguettes and cheese and wine. Don't spend your time looking for bad things. That's what touring is about. Lachpor or leragel are the opposite. They are about searching out a place's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. This is what spying is about. The exclusive use of the verb latour in our parsha, repeated 12 times, is there to tell us that the 12 men were not sent to spy, but only 2 of them understood this, right? And I think that is the place here where we're thinking about the Yosef story, right? That seeing sort of the nakedness of the land, right? I think what Yosef might be saying, if we sort of read Rabbi Sachs back into that parsha, is listen, the brothers are coming down here only to try and find the bad parts instead of the good parts. And that is the problem there. And here, right, only 2 of the 12 men understood that was not helpful. That's not the thing that we want to do right now. The Israelites, at that stage, did not need spies. The people needed something else entirely. Moses had told them that the land was good. It was flowing with milk and honey. But Moses had never seen the land, right? No one had. Why should they believe him? They needed the independent testimony of eyewitnesses. That was the mission of the 12. 10 of the 12 men thought they were part of a story of espionage. The result was that they looked for the wrong things, came to the wrong conclusion, demoralized the people, destroyed the hope of an entire generation, and will eternally be remembered as responsible for one of the worst failures in Jewish history. I believe that this is Rabbi Sachs speaking, that the story we tell affects the decisions we make. Get the story wrong, and we can rob an entire generation of the future. Get it right, as Yehoshua and Caleb did, and we can achieve greatness. Right. So what Rabbi Sachs is saying is when we look at a situation, we have to figure out what story we're in. Are we in a drama, a thriller, a suspense, a romance, right? And if you sort of misread the signs of the person standing across from you, your fellow actors, or sort of the mission that you're being sent on, that you could really ruin or derail your story. And so it is, Rabbi Sachs wrote this at the beginning of 2020, or the end, I guess, right? This time of year in 2020. And he was talking about, interestingly, about how we tell the story of the pandemic, which is something that I think is a little bit less sticky now, perhaps. But I think that there are so many other interesting stories that are being written in our country, in the land of Israel, and thinking about what is our job at any given point when we go see something, if we go to a protest or we see something unfold in our own backyard, is our job to be a spy, to sort of fix the problem, to identify the problem and then set out to fix it? Or is our job latour, to find the best in the situation in front of us, to see the best intentions of the people in front of us, and to somehow be able to tell that story instead? It reminds me of, there's a funny YouTube video of 2 people, a woman and a man, that are in some kind of relationship, and the woman is complaining and the man is looking at her and he sees a nail and he is a hammer, right? And she says, stop looking at me like I'm a nail. I just want you to listen to me, right? And he was only able to liragel, right? To find the worst parts and then find some strategy, right? The spies didn't want just live in the desert forever, but the way they told the story made it so that it didn't work out for them. And it's only if they could have sort of shaken off that thing they thought they were supposed to do the thing they were really meant to do, to be the eyewitness testimony of a land that is beautiful and flowing with milk and honey, even if there are parts that will need fixing eventually, to focus on the good, that there could have been such a different story. There could have been such a different outcome here. And so I think that, again, sort of intertwining the story with the story of Yosef is to maybe ask us to view this week's Parsha through Yosef's eyes, right? To think about people who come back from who are going towards the land of Israel, right? But coming back with bad reports about the land that was his heritage, right? Of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And how would he, what would his instincts be in that moment? How would he be able to talk to those people? So I think that when Moshe looks back at the end of Devarim, he's actually looking back with sadness, right? He's saying they went up into the mountains and they spied it out. That wasn't really what they were meant to do. And look where that took us to, right? Had they not done that, maybe I would never have hit the rock and I could have gotten into Israel. You can imagine the being able to look back and see that missed opportunity. And I think that sometimes, right, really scary things are hard to latour because all we can see are the really scary parts. But if we could manage to be as brave as Yehoshua and Caleb, we can see all the beauty that even challenges have to offer to us. So I'm going to stop talking and welcome other people's thoughts or ideas.
I've always had the feeling that Bnei Israel were not prepared properly for all the challenges they were going to be facing.
Mm-hmm.
Moshe's a half hour late and they're building a golden calf. And these spies are supposed to be leaders of the tribes, right? And they just don't seem to have the faith in God. But I don't feel like we can blame them. I feel like Hashem and Moshe were supposed to somehow empower them a little more and make them feel like this is going to work. I mean, it should have been, with Gan Eden, you wonder, was that really going to be the long-term situation? Were we all going to be living in Gan Eden, or that was never the long-term plan? But here it seems like, yeah, they really were supposed to, go into Israel a few weeks later. And yet, it doesn't seem that they, were prepared properly to do it. I mean, you had to go for 40 years for everyone to die out. I mean, that's,
Thank you for saying that, Marlene, because I think that it's a really fair point, right? It's, I think that actually, as many similarities as there might be between Yosef's story and this story, they're very different. Right? We expect better of the 12 tribes who grew up in Yaakov's house, who had all the sort of maybe grooming or pedigree of being leaders, maybe for better or worse, wherever that got them. But here we are talking about slaves who have just been freed, who've just had this really tumultuous experience of revelation in the desert, and they're perhaps not equipped. And it's not. I struggle every time we read these parshiot at the end of Bamidbar, because I, on the one hand, feel really frustrated. Why can't the people get it together? And on the other hand, I want to feel what I think you just described really beautifully, which is they might not have had enough faith, but they weren't given any of the tools either. Right? You can imagine that we think, oh, Vayaturu 12 times. It's so obvious. God was saying scout, but it's almost like Moshe was saying scout and winking, and that might not have been enough for even the Nisiei Hamatot, right? Even the best, the chieftains, the Anashim, the important people of each tribe, they might have needed more. Look, you might see some scary things, but if you could come back with a really accurate eyewitness report, that's what we need, right? And instead, being left to their own devices, they made mistakes. But what I hear you saying, Marlene, is who can really blame them, right? And without the proper scaffolding, it's not fair to expect them to have caught that nuance. And I think that's really fair.
But sad.
Yeah. And it reminds me that faith is sometimes is like part of a vicious cycle in a good way, hopefully, right? But like if God had given more support, more direction, the people may have had more faith, which would have helped God feel more supportive, right? You see it with like sports and coaches, right? That like if you're not really bought into it, then the coach gives you a harder time, and you sort of pull back, then the coach gives you a harder time, right? Parenting might also sometimes feel this way. And so it's we are quick to blame B'nai Israel for having a lack of faith, but it is a part of a cycle, and perhaps they weren't given enough support to really jump into the faith-driven cycle all the way.
I mean, I think right now we're feeling the lack of leadership in America and Israel. Like, I don't know if Abraham Lincoln was as great as we all think he is now, but we're looking for some guidance, some wisdom, and couldn't seem to prevent the golden calf, and Moshe can't seem to prevent them from falling apart and not getting into the country. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, I hear that. Nelson,
I,
did you have
I
something
had
to add?
one.
Yeah.
I had one idea. Imagine that instead of those days that we were in 1948, and the spies come in and say, "Look, Israel is tiny. There are Arab armies surrounding it from every direction. Don't go there." And so they say, "Okay, well, let's wait another generation to go into the promised land." Or 1967, look, we are surrounded by powerful enemies. There's no way that we, a tiny nation with a tiny army, can beat them. So the spies failed to see one thing, a secret weapon that Moses had that they did not anticipate, which was God's hand in history. So they didn't see that maybe their mission was not to describe exactly like spies. Maybe it was more like scouting, like tell where to go. God will guide us and will protect us, will be part of the secret weapon of the Israelites at that time. So that was my take, as you were talking.
I like that. I think, first of all, that it's like I almost got the chills, right? Thinking about like, right, if that is a modern example, 48 or 67, and to think that it would be until the 90s that we would have another chance, right? Another 40, 50 years in the desert, so to speak. That it's heartbreaking to imagine history being written out that way. And so I think it gives me almost even more empathy for the slaves, the B'nai Israel, the ex-slaves, right? To think about what they ended up giving up in that moment. And the other piece that I really like is it's about that nakedness of the land, right? Maybe there wasn't a whole lot of good to report, right? You get sent as like a travel agent, whatever, to go to some place that's not so great, right? But you have to write a good review of some sort for the journal, the book that she's writing. And so you end up sort of making something look better than it is. That's also dibat ra'ah, right? It's not, I don't think, but I think what you're saying, Nelson, is that no matter how bad the land looked, there was a good report to bring back, which is God is going to deliver this place to us, even if it's a place that looks like it might swallow its inhabitants, even if the people are so big they eat grapes that are gigantic, right? And that they missed the biggest highlight of the tour, which was God's role in taking the lands. And that it's interesting to think about touring for something you can't really see, right? Like you can't see that. You can't say it shows up on this cross street. It's more talking about the feel of the walk down the promenade, or the feel of the stars over your head in the desert, when you're touring some, safari. And it's an even harder thing to describe, right? It's a much harder challenge than we were initially giving the scouts / spies. But of course, Moshe handpicked the best of the best, which, again, I think like you can see both sides. Like on the one hand, how could B'nai Israel not have had faith in God after getting to experience Har Sinai? And on the other hand, they're not equipped. It's true, no matter how much faith you have. But these scouts did not seem to use their faith in God to accurately describe the mission or the challenge. I agree. I think that's a lot of wisdom, as always, there.
Well, look at 1948. The land was naked and poor, and lots of stone, and they had to clean every inch of the land to make it flourish. So it was the naked land, the same idea.
Some of it is like being able to describe what will be instead of what is. Right. And I think that requires a lot of faith and also a lot of imagination,
Exactly.
not to be undersold.
What was the vision that they had?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. If someone had seen Israel in 1948 and said, look, it's a desert, swampland, forget it.
Yeah.
Right. But someone saw trees blooming and right. And that was all it took, was the vision. And I think, look, I think also, this coming from slavery, coming from generations of slavery, it's hard to grow a vision. That is certainly something that comes, I think, from more freedom. Although certainly coming out of 1948, a post-Holocaust generation also suffers mightily.
Yeah.
I don't know. A lot to consider. I do feel for B'nai Israel, and I feel for them, and I feel like I want to shake them all at the same time. We also obviously have the wisdom of hindsight, but I think if anything, what is valuable to take away from it is how to be our own better scouts in the future, right? How to shake the suspicion and the fears of spying, and to see the best and the beautiful and what can be in any situation. As we navigate our own challenges.
What would have made a difference?
It's a great question. What do you think?
I don't know.
I think, go ahead.
No, I don't know. I just feel like God and Moses failed to educate, to inspire, to foster faith and trust in them, that they were like, hey, we want to go back to Egypt. There was good food there. I mean, really?
So what could have been different, right? One thing is to play the role of Moshe, right? What could be different? We could be better Moshes to our miragels or our people laturing, right? We could give better support, more explicit direction, better visioning, right, to the people that we talk to. I think that's one way to view the story and to learn something. And the other is maybe to say, before you do something scary, if you don't feel like you have the information, right? Why didn't they ask more questions? Why didn't they say, well, when you say Latour, what does that really mean? I'm not familiar. I've never been a scout before, right? It's hard to know what private conversations go on outside of the recorded Torah, but I think that both sides, when you're about to enter into a big thing and there's not clear direction on either side, both teams are responsible to make clarity, right? So Moshe and God should have been clearer. The Nisi'ei Matot should have asked more questions if they were unclear. And then I think that letting oneself have the faith to see the beauty, even when it's not really readily available to us, that is something we can do even when we don't really know what we're doing, as long as we have that, can cultivate that faith and that emotion. Because we see, right, Marlene, in the end, Caleb and Yehoshua did it, right? They did the thing that they were supposed to do, which makes me think that perhaps all 12 of them could have risen to that challenge, right?
You think?
I mean, the other way to think about it is the way the Ibn Ezra did, which is, right, to say that they said something that wasn't true, right? Sometimes when we don't like something, my children do it all the time, right? They embellish the truth to justify their behaviors, right? Oh, there was a big spider. I couldn't go to the bathroom downstairs because there were too many big spiders. When like there are no spiders at all, right? That's like pure dibot ra'ah.
But so we don't even understand what the 10 guys were thinking, why they would, speak Lashon Hara about this land that they were entrusted to say to the people, oh yeah, we're going to go and it's going to be great. And they completely don't do that. So why not? Like, what was in They were so frightened, or I try to find something in the parsha I can relate to. I can relate to being very frightened, but here you are, like, having a lot of direct communication, at least through Moshe, with God, and you're still like, yeah, it's gonna be too hard or too much or too difficult.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine being
very hard
so
for me to
frightened. What to think about feeling so lost in like the vastness of the desert, so lost that you think you might want to go back to the people who enslaved you, right? Some feeling of just wanting the certainty that was behind you. And then also you could think about, sometimes I am too harsh on people, or I offer too many, of what I think are vulnerabilities or weaknesses because I'm trying to make things better, right? Perhaps the Meraglim were ultimately, we're hoping that the people would say, okay, really big people, we need this kind of strategy to get into the land of Israel, right? Oh, it swallows its inhabitants, we better bring all of our whatever with us, right? Maybe they thought, oh, we're strategizing. And if we say the worst things, if we prepare for the worst case scenario, then we'll be fine when we get there. I think that's like maybe a very Don the Cuffs flute way of thinking about what they were doing. Right. But
well,
you have to look in front of you. Is that going to help the person or is that going to terrify them? And clearly the scouts didn't read the national feeling, right? I think we see that in Israel a lot right now, that the leaders don't always see what will cause what reaction in the people. And so perhaps they thought they were doing something helpful and they just didn't understand that the people didn't want that. They weren't ready for that.
Well, that should have come from the scouts. They should have said, wow, this is hard and this is big and this, but we can still do it. God's with us. Or we have these, I don't know what, strategies to do it. That should have come from the lead. That's what we need leaders for us.
Yeah.
Aren't smart enough most of the time, to figure this stuff out. But when you have such a lack, and that's the word I want to use, of leadership. I mean, what's going on in the news here, what's going on in the news in Israel, it's scary to me. And it's like, where are people with some wisdom to guide us? So I don't know. Whatever. It's a hard concept. Very hard for me to.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine what were Bnei Israel's options when they got these reports. Could they have said, that sounds scary, how can we overcome them? Could they have said, but did you see anything beautiful? Right? Could they have said, do you think God will help us overcome this? They could have asked the right questions, but as you said, it's very hard, especially in sort of that mass panic, anxiety, fight or flight response that sometimes comes with big crowds, to be able to say that. And so we do rely on our leaders to guide us.
Well, Moshe didn't say that stuff either. You're expecting the people to say it, but Moshe didn't say it.
Yes. No, exactly right. That's what I'm saying is like, if I were thinking about like, what could I learn from this for myself, those, right. Ask more clarifying questions before I go, ask more clarifying questions when they come back. But yes, that our leaders, we do expect them to do better than this, right? We want them to rise above. Look, this is, as Rabbi Sachs said, this is one of the great failures of Jewish history, right? And that's not because the people failed, but because everyone really failed, the leadership, Moshe, and there was not enough faith in what could be, and the results are so tragic for everybody.
Yep.
And as I said last week, like the whining of last week might culminate in right. Maybe if half the camp hadn't been burned in last week's parsha, the spies would have been more, the scouts would have been more confident. Right. Maybe they felt really shaken. This like really bad, scary thing had just happened. And then after the quail, half the people died with the food stuck in their teeth. Right. There seemed to have been like two really terrifying things happening there. Miriam had just had this massive failure of leadership where she had to be sent out of the camp, right? I could imagine that even in the best of scenarios, even with the clearest of directions, this is like not a stable time. And in fact, this failure might lead to the Korach failure of next week's Parsha, right? Where Korach says like, enough. Right? We saw Miriam fail. And then as you're saying, Marlene, like what happened to Moshe? What happened to these 12 scouts? For someone else to give it a try, right? Now, of course, Korach doesn't do it in the right way or for the right reasons, perhaps. Maybe some of which we can look at next week. But I think you can see how all these things lead to the next. And if only a firm leader could sort of take it in hands, maybe the ship could have been steered in a different direction.
Yep.
Yeah. As I said, it's a hard few parshiot here. It's hard to see, and it definitely feels like it happens. I think part of what I found compelling about this comparison to Yosef is that it happens all the time, right? History continues to cycle and repeat itself. And that's sort of what I took from that story is like it happened on the way down, it's happening on the way back up. It happens today, right? And so it can be frustrating to feel like we're reading about what should be ancient history and we see those same patterns of poor leadership, of lack of clarity, of lack of faith in God, lack of viewing opportunity in our own lives. And so it's hard. It's not an uplifting parsha.
Seems like a contrast to the people who went to Israel in the 40s, 30s, whenever, and after the war, and were determined and weren't giving up. I listened to Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik's Jerusalem podcast, and people were determined, and the people who failed to win Jerusalem in 48 were not going to not do it in 67. When another situation came up, that was it. They were very positive and very religious, not religious, but everybody seemed to have faith that this was meant to be, and were, somewhat united in accomplishing it.
I think that's the question, right? I think you put your finger on it. How do we harness our faith to be united in achieving our goals? And hopefully the optimism or the hope that we can take from this week's Parsha is sort of understanding what not to do, understanding the way that it is meant to be. And I think that's what is so powerful about Rabbi Sachs's article is to say, Latour, right? If we only had listened more carefully, Latour means to look for the best in things. And so I hope that we can come out of this week's Parsha saying, okay, so we're going to break that cycle, right? We're going to be great tayarim, tourists, not miraglim, in whatever we do, and to try to find that good and to find that faith so we can be united together.
Yeah, they have a more positive focus.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
I also remember reading Sachs in another, maybe it was about this Parsha, or the Israelites have to overcome their slave mentality before they could assume the responsibility to go and take destiny on their own hands. They were still used to getting food from the Egyptians, manna from God, quail, and what have you. They would have to go and labor on their own, and obviously they didn't see that coming. They had to. So Moshe said, "Okay, you're not ready. Let's go on." And defend Moshe.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. All right. Well, we'll pick back up with yet another tragedy unfolding in next week's Parsha with Korach. And then I'll be in town, not this Shabbat, but next Shabbat, to share more thoughts about Korach and Shul as well.
All right.
Thank you.
Noam is coming?
Noam is coming.
Good. Okay.
Yes, the most popular member of our team.
Yeah.
All right. Everyone have a good week and a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Okay.
Thank